A couple of years ago, I did a project where I was trying to figure out a dining room light for us, as we're in desperate need for better lighting in our dining room. So the idea at that point was to model some sort of organic form, which ended up being a starfruit, and to scan a starfruit into the computer and get a model, then section that model and cut out all of those sections and make a shade for a light tube in our dining room. What I ended up making was just a scale version of what I was thinking about. In the time since working on this, I was never really able to come up with a good material to make a bigger version of this out of, or at least nothing I was excited about. And I didn't really like the idea of a big volume hanging down in the space over the table. So I ended up going with a different idea, where I would make 3 panels that are closer to the ceiling to illuminate the table. The idea with this was to take a section of the surface of the moon and model that in Blender, then section it and cut those sections out on the CNC machine to make a similar form to what I did with the starfruit, but it would be more of a panel that's up against the ceiling and more of a one-sided piece instead of something that's volumetric. So I set up a file in Blender where I could go between 3 different sections of the moon quickly just by changing the file that it was reading. I also, in looking at it, didn't really like the surface when it was made from a flat plane. So I took the plane that I was mapping the texture onto and gave it a little bit of a bulge. I'm sure there's a way in Blender to do this so it's more like fabric and more like something hanging from the ceiling. But I just sort of pushed out the center and let it kind of fall into the volume of the dining room. And it just gave the surface a little bit more shape. Then I could take those sections and draw them into something I could cut on the CNC machine. What also happened at about this time is I won a pallet of salvaged wood at an auction that wasn't too far away. So I was able to run down and get that wood, and it seemed like a nice material to make this project out of. We tried to just put the pallet in the truck, but it wasn't quite going to fit. So I had to load everything on the pallet into the truck by hand. Luckily, there was someone who watches my videos there and recognized me, and he helped me load the truck, which was super nice. So big thanks to Andrew from Vancouver. I did have to unload everything and bring it into the shop, and it now kind of sits in the middle of the shop, sort of in the way, but not too bad. I picked out a few pieces that I could use. This wood that I had got looked like most of the pieces were about 7 inches wide, and many of the sections that I had drawn and was going to need to cut out were a little bit wider than that. So instead of cutting out the sections on each board, what I decided to do was to glue up a bunch of these pieces into a bigger panel, sort of like making a sheet of plywood that I could then cut out many of the sections on the CNC at once. So first I planed and jointed the pieces to get them cleaned up. Then I cut them to a length for the panels I was going to make. And I cleaned up the edges. I might have been able to get away with just gluing the pieces together the way they were. But what I ended up doing was cutting a spline into each seam. This would help the pieces go together and be planar with each other. I thought about using biscuits for this. As I cut the sections out of the bigger piece, I didn't know where those seams were going to fall, and I may end up with a seam where there's no biscuit. So I thought I needed a continuous spline along the entire joint. I also took some of the shorter pieces and spline those together to make some of the parts to make the bigger panels. So that's what I'm doing here, is gluing the ends of smaller pieces together. And this was a lot of work for a few extra pieces of wood. It did make for less waste. All of this work could have been avoided by just using a big sheet of plywood, but they call it woodworking for a reason. I can then clean up those pieces that I made out of the smaller parts and get the edges cleaned up. I jointed and planed these after I glued the parts together. If I jointed and planed and then glued the pieces together, then I'd have to join and plane them again, and then they'd become thinner than my other pieces, and they just wouldn't work. I can start to glue the bigger panels together now. I had to cut the splines that I was going to need. I thought about doing a tongue and groove joint between each piece, and I think that would have worked too. But I started down the road of doing splines, so that's what I ended up doing. But I think a tongue and groove joint would have been as easy and would have worked just as well. I found with these I could do 3 at a time and glue those sections together, then glue the sections of 3 together into bigger pieces, then finally glue the whole panel together in the end. My work table's about 6 feet, 5-6 feet wide or long, and the CNC table is 8 feet. So my panels needed to be somewhere in between those 2 lengths. Then for the final glue up, I got out the longer clamps. I glued some tabs onto the panels, thinking they would help in holding the panel to the CNC table, but I ended up not using them as much as I would have thought. Then it was a lot of cutting on the CNC machine. What I ended up doing was cutting out about 3 or 4 pieces, and I could hold the panel with my hold downs at that end, then moving the center hold downs and doing the next section of cutouts. It was only slightly slower than cutting out the whole panel at once. It just meant I was being a little more careful with where the hold downs were and making sure the piece was held in place well on the table.
Bed goes up.
And it was much more fragile once it was cut. I made fairly big bridges between the panel and the cutout, and I figured I would then spend some time cleaning those off. I drew manually the side pieces for the panel that's going to go on the ceiling. So it's sort of the side of the box. And it's flat on the ceiling side. The other side is the height of the section that goes at each location on the side panel. I also cut a dado into these for each section, so the sections would be spaced nicely. This project was a lot of keeping track of parts and directions of parts and making sure pieces were going to fit together. I really didn't have any issues with making any kind of major screw up with something being mirrored or backwards or cutting something on the wrong side or all the kinds of things that I usually seem to do. Then I did a lot of cleaning up and sanding. And I can do a dry fit of the first box. So this is the box closest to the kitchen. And it's also the box with the most relief, or the sort of the most height in the sections. I ordered some lights, which I tested out, and it seemed to work. In looking at this first box, I didn't really clean up the ends of the sections. Some of them were a little pointier than I would have liked now that I see it made. And my side panels weren't quite at the right heights. So I wanted to go through and manually reshape the side panel just a little bit. So I marked what I wanted to cut off, and I carefully cut off a little bit of the side panels. In cleaning up these pieces on the spindle sander, I decided I could cut off some on the bandsaw and then reshape those cuts on the spindle sander. And it would look just as though I had cut it all on the CNC machine. Or the whole surface of the cut I could make look similar all the way along. And at this point I have one panel put together, not glued, but just all the parts together. And I decided it was working well enough so I could make the other two panels. So it was the same process, although this time I knew a little bit more what I was doing. So it went a little faster. So I just powered through the other two panels, which was just a lot of cutting and a lot of gluing. So I'm putting the bigger panels together now. You can see one of the sectioned pieces. One of the things I did with these sections is I cleaned up the ends so that I would have a little bit of a flatter end on the sections. And this would allow it to attach to the sides a little bit nicer. It would just feel like everything was going together the way it should, instead of just kind of shoved together. And I could cut out all the sections. And with these, I ended up using the jigsaw to cut the bridges. I think that worked a little bit better than using the chisel. And I cut the sides I was going to need. And with the cleaned up ends on the sections, the sides ended up being the right shape, right out of the CNC machine. And I could clean up all of the pieces, just lots and lots of sanding. I started with the biggest drum on the sander and worked over each piece with successively smaller drums, getting into more and more of the spaces of the surface. One of the things I wanted to do was to round over the side of the section that was going to be near the light. The thought being just to kind of soften that edge and to maybe let a few photons more of light into the dining room. In looking at the box I had made, I thought it would be okay to add just a little bit of height to the box. So around the outside, on the two sides and the two ends, I added a strip that adds, I think, 1.5 inches. And it makes the box a little bit taller and it brings the surface into the room just a little bit. The big thing I wanted to do with this was to give the light tubes just a little bit more space. The LEDs don't really get hot, but I just didn't like the idea that they were so close to the wood. So this gives the lights lots of room inside the panel. So to attach this strip, I could just use biscuits. That'll kind of keep the two surfaces aligned nicely. And I did that on the end pieces as well. One of the things I got at the auction was a tool chest of drawers that had some tools in it. And one of the things it had in it was some brushes. So I actually found this nice brush for putting glue on at the same auction that I got the wood at. What was tricky in adding this piece to the bottom of the CNC pieces was that I had to get the ends perfectly flush without cutting off any of the existing piece. So I had to sort of sneak up on that surface with the table saw blade and then cut off the extra of the new strip. But it worked okay. And that was actually the easy part. Even more tricky part was cutting the dado, or the ravet, I guess, at the end of the side pieces, because it had to be the same depth and flush at the surface. With a little bit of care, it came out okay. Then I can lay out the new boxes and I fit everything together. Some of the section pieces I had to do a little extra sanding to get them to fit. Now I have all three boxes clamped together. I spent probably a day procrastinating actually gluing these up, because once they were glued together, I couldn't make any changes. And I got them aligned the way my original images were aligned. So you can kind of see how the height maps work with the bumps on the panels. So after thinking about how to glue these up, I decided to try putting the glue into all of the dados at once, then trying to put all the sections in at once. This seemed like a good idea, but it ended up not working. The first problem was that these aren't just straight pieces, they're actually off balance, so they don't stay in the dado. Then the second problem was the second side on the top. I could not get all of the sections to go into their dados at the same time. It's virtually impossible. So I ended up taking it all apart, wiping out as much of the glue as I could, and I ended up gluing the panels together the way that I had put them together when dry fitting them. I made the outer frame first, then put each section in on its own. So I'd be dealing with just the dado at each end at any one time. And this ended up working. I'm not sure why I didn't do this originally. I think I was thinking that I'd be pushing out too much of the glue when I was putting the section in, but there's so many glue joints that even if each glue joint is only 10% of what it could be, it's still plenty. So this ended up working just fine with a little bit of help from the mallet. And once everything was together, I could make sure it was square. And for the most part, this was okay. I think on one of them, I had to clamp one end down to the table and then push the other end just a little bit to get it square. But it sort of doesn't really matter how square it is. Then I could put the other panels together, and I knew more what I was doing at this point. So now they're all glued up, and I can start to put finish on. So I started painting the finish on with a brush. I thought I would try using shellac as it dries really fast. So after doing a few sections with the brush, I decided it was going really slow and maybe I should try spraying these. So I got out a sprayer that I got a few years ago and I've never used, but I thought it would be a good chance to test it out. And even with a small compressor, it actually worked pretty well. And I got everything sprayed in probably 10 minutes, and the surface was probably better. I need to make 2 supports inside the panel to support the light tubes. So I found some scrap pieces that I could make those supports out of, and I cleaned those up. Then I had to cut all of these supports to a very precise length so they would fit within the frame of the panel. And as these were going to be flush with the ceiling, and I didn't want to screw on the outside of the box, I ended up using pocket screws. This seemed like a good place for them. And on the downside of these supports, I need the little clips that will hold the light tubes. So I can attach 2 of those to each strut. And you can see where those supports are going to go. And I can put the pocket screws in at this point. And you can see how the light tubes go in. I had the supports towards the end so I could put the lights in after the supports were in place. I'm making sort of a closed box, so I have to be careful I'm not boxing something in or out during the process. That is a little bit of a concern in that this whole thing has to come down if I ever need to replace one of these light tubes. I'm hoping these last a while. And I had to make a little hole for the plug. One mistake I made on this project was that I made the boxes a little bit longer than the light tubes so the lights would fit, but I didn't take into account the connections at the ends of the lights. So I just barely had enough room for the lights and the wiring. I also had to figure out a way to attach the panel to the ceiling. And in measuring the trusses and thus the ceiling joists and their spacing, I figured out I could put a piece of blocking at each corner of the panel with a hole in that blocking for a screw. And if I'm lucky, I can get that screw hole to line up with the ceiling joists. And we can just put these up and I can screw them right into the ceiling. So here's one of the issues with the wiring is I didn't have enough space at the end to plug the light in. So I ended up having to cut a little bit of a space into the side. I clamped a scrap piece of wood to the side, then I could drill a wide hole into the side and the scrap piece, and that gave me a little cutout that gives me room for the plug. And I can bring the lights in, and we move the table. I've got a whole video about making that table, which I'll put a link to. And I could use my lift, which I also have a whole video to, and I'll put a link to that too. The lift ended up being really useful, but it wasn't the end all in that the bottom of the panel isn't flat. So when we put it up, we're gonna push these spacers against this edge, and then it should be centered. Okay. So then we don't have to worry about it this way. We only have to worry about it this way. Okay. Much easier. I really needed someone to hold the panel in place while I lifted it up. Having help from Bonnie and Calvin was super important, but having the lift was also super important. It sort of all worked together. My first attempt and my first couple of screws didn't go into anything, and I was all worried that my spacing was off. But it turned out that we just had to nudge the whole piece over about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a centimeter. And then all 4 screws went into the bottom of the joists. So for the next 2, I actually drilled some test holes into the ceiling just to make sure there was something there when we put the panel up. And that really helped because that meant I knew exactly where the panel had to go, which is where the lift really helped. I think having 2 people trying to hold the panel up at the ceiling in exactly the right location would have been really hard. So you can see how we're sort of using hands and the lift at the same time. Once I get 2 screws in, we can stop holding it and we can bring the lift down. And actually all 12 screws went into something, so I'm very confident that this isn't going to fall down. So the other thing that was a little bit complicated, I didn't want to have the wire that goes between the 3 different panels going outside the box and then over the beam on the ceiling and then into the other box. So I drilled some holes up into the attic and I fished the wire through so that you don't see it on the outside. And this was a little bit hard as I didn't have very much space to work. So I had to use a pair of pliers to kind of force the plug into where it's supposed to go. We had our first meal, which was takeout, which just seems wrong, but it was very good. Bonnie said she wanted a lot of light, so I wasn't worried about having too much light. I think for me, it's just a hair, like 10% too bright. I think putting only 1 light tube in each box wouldn't have been enough light, so I think it's about right. And it definitely gives a definition to the table now. It's really kind of a nice space where you feel like you're in this pool of light with darkness around you. The color temperature is slightly warmer than the kitchen, which I've always kind of thought was sort of a bad thing to do in a space. I think it actually helps give a definition between the dining room and the kitchen, which is kind of nice. Thanks for watching.
What's wrong with this stuff?
Thanks for watching.